Hello, and welcome to Bloke on the Range. This evening, by popular demand, a rifle I did not make from a cut-up Lee Enfield No. 4. Hello, so this is Frankenrifle, and for those who've not yet made her acquaintance, here's a couple of clips of aimed rapid fire. $14.56. So we've had a lot of comments under YouTube videos asking exactly what Frankenrifle is, and some even accusing me of having done nefarious things like having cut up a perfectly good No. 4. Nothing could be further from the truth. Now, Frankenrifle was actually built from the ground up as a 7.62x39 by the now defunct Australian International Arms. Apparently they couldn't make it into the US market because they'd sourced their timber in Vietnam. So having fallen afoul of US import restrictions, they just lost a huge chunk of their market share right there and went bust a few years ago. This one was made about 10 years ago, and before it was customised it looked a bit like this. So first of all, a bit of background on the action. It's essentially a No. 4 Mark 1 star type action with the bolt release there, as opposed to a push button there. This is cheaper to manufacture, and most of the North American No. 4s during the war and after were made like that. I'm not going to take this off right now, but it's a Mark II type trigger mechanism where the trigger is pivoted on a lug on the receiver rather than on the trigger guard. Looking back over on this side, it's been production engineered for easier manufacturing, and a lot of the lightning cuts have been left off, and it's generally a much squarer action. It takes an AK magazine, which goes into a special magazine adapter. Now, the magazines that come with it are 10 rounds and work fine, but a lot of military surplus ones, they need a bit of work. They need to be fettled a bit with a Dremel, because particularly around here, around this corner, if it's been built up underneath, it won't feed. An AK's got a ruddy great lug on the bottom that runs down in there and strips the rounds out, whereas this has just a round bolt, and the bolt doesn't go as far down into the magazine as on an AK. Now, talking of the bolt, here's a major departure from the original Lee-Enfields. Now, the original Lee-Enfields will have a flat bolt face with an extractor claw hooking round onto it. And how they manage their ejection is that the extractor claw pushes the rim of the case against the side wall of the receiver, and with an empty case it's actually friction with the side wall that works as the ejector. On an original, there's also an ejector screw about here, so that any cases or live rounds that don't eject under friction will flip out. Now, with the flat bolt face, what this means is that a Lee-Enfield is controlled feed, which means that as the round rises out of the magazine, the rim hooks under the ejector. So actually, to unload an original Lee-Enfield, you don't have to close the bolt each time. You can just work the bolt backwards and forwards, and actually the screw ejector comes into use mostly there. Now, because of the smaller rim diameter on the 7.62x39, it's unrealistic to be able to use this kind of ejection, so they went to a recessed bolt face with a spring plunger right there. Slight downside of this is this extractor is quite a bit smaller and is quite a bit weaker than the originals, so I found that I couldn't run steel cased ammunition in there particularly. Wolf would go, but surplus wouldn't. Otherwise, the bolt is basically identical to a No. 4. Now let's start at the back end and work forward with what we changed. Wooden butt off, polymer one on, basic commercial one. Now unfortunately the butt socket is not the same as on a number 4, so my tame gun plumber who put this one together for me had to do quite a lot of work to make that fit, but it does. Secondly, I've got a number 5 Jungle Carbine rear sight on it, which you can tell it's a number 5 one because it's only scaled up to 800 and the battle sight's a lot lower. On a number 4 rear sight, the battle sight is set to about 450 yards. I've no idea what this one's meant to be set for, but it's much lower and much more practical. Now, the original rear sight that came with these is a Mark II type 2-position flip with holes that are really too small. It's also drilled and tapped for a rail that fits on there. Fits on there like that, which is intended to be able to mount a scope over the original rear sight. Obviously this rear sight you can't. Now what I had to do here, it's a minor thing, but I had to get my Dremel out and relieve the edge of the metal right there so that the rear sight could fold flat, because the elevation nut impinged on it and it wouldn't sit flat. That's just a little minor annoyance. Now this cover here is purely cosmetic, it's from the stock set. Then moving forward is where it gets interesting. Now the original barrels on these, great idea, they weren't provided with a shoulder to breech them up. How they were made was that the thread on the barrel was rather longer and they had a breeching up nut here. Interesting manufacturing shortcut, interesting idea. The idea being that you take the barrel, you screw it up loosely, you put a headspace gauge in, you nip it down up to the onto the headspace gauge, and then you tighten the barrel nut. Job jobbed. Unfortunately, of the two my tame gun plumber had his hands on, he had this one and he had another one that he converted to 6.5 Grendel. The nuts were not done up very tight, and he showed me with great glee when he took the original barrel off this one. He just put a little drift on the nut and just tapped it gently with a little jeweler's hammer and it just went ding and was off. Also on top of that, the barrel threads were not very well cut. Now he said that the receiver threads were absolutely fine, but the threads on the barrel were really out of tolerance, which explained why the original barrel wouldn't hold 0. Desperately tried to get it to hold 0 at 100 meters and it just wouldn't. It was perfectly accurate for miniative pig at 50 yards, but for something you want to shoot targets with, it just wasn't really adequate. Now the barrel is actually a 308 match barrel with an extremely tight chamber on it, and being a bit of a geek I managed to spec my own reamer. So it's a Sami minimum 762x39 chamber with the same throat configuration as a 308 Palmer match. Yeah, geeky, I know. What I wanted this to be set up to do was to shoot Sierra Match Kings and cast bullets intended for 308 Winchester. And with 135 grain Sierra Match Kings at 100 meters, I've reproducibly produced half-minute of angle groups with this with a scope. If anyone doubts me, I'll photograph some of the groups I've kept and put them on the Facebook page, which you should like, by the way. In fact, this chamber is so tight that Lapua 123 grain Spitzers don't chamber in it, and the Lee Precision Harris type 762x39 bullet mold doesn't go either. This rifle likes the Lyman 160 grain silhouette bullet, if anyone cared. Now moving on down, what we've got here is an AR-15 free float tube. What we did with this to free float the barrel properly and not worry about bedding issues, there's a bearing surface on the barrel. It's a couple of inches long here. It's as thick as we could possibly make it, and then there's an offset bushing. You can see it's an asymmetric bushing there in the carbon fibre tube, and pairs of grub screws hold that onto the fat part of the barrel. Now up at this end we've got an original part that we took off the rifle. Here's the original foresight assembly. Now originally this was threaded and had a flash suppressor on it. The flash suppressor was awful, had to go. Another slightly clever manufacturing shortcut they did, they put a very, very fine thread on the muzzles, and then what you do is you tighten up this assembly, align it, and then there's a clamp. There's a clamping screw here. And we thought, well, we've got a clamping screw, so we can just get rid of that thread. So we did. Got rid of the thread, it's now got a bearing for that, and it just clamps on. And then we put a proper thread for a DNTC. Nasty, evil, noisy thing. Works brilliantly, as you can see in the videos. By the way, in the videos, that's 160 grains of lead doing 2200 feet per second, and there's almost no recoil because of this thing, but there's big clouds of smoke coming out the side. It's brilliant. Foresight here is quite clever. You can adjust for elevation with a slotted screw in there, and for windage you can adjust there. It's a push me pull you type 2 screw arrangement. And last and least of the modifications, got a bit of an ersatz trigger stop here. Block of rubber glued onto the back of the trigger guard so that the trigger over travel is reduced. And that's about it. So, now you know. Join us again for another episode of Bloke on the Range.